The narrow canyon funneled the sound of hooves and boots, every echo growing sharper, closer. Moonlight spilled across jagged rock, glinting off rifle barrels as shadows emerged at both ends. Samuel's breath was steady, but his pulse hammered like war drums. Beside him, Ayana's knife caught a sliver of silver light, her eyes locked on the darkness ahead. There was no way out, only forward. In one motion, Samuel stepped into the open, shielding her with his frame. In the narrow canyon, the cold moon draped itself over two solitary figures. Samuel stood between Ayana and the line of guns aimed at them. In his hand, the bill of sale, the chain on her freedom, was torn to pieces, scattering in the wind. "You're free," he said, voice calm as stone. Footsteps closed in. And then, the summer of 1867 had no mercy on Dust Hollow. The sun hung like molten copper above the cracked earth, its heat turning the air into a shimmering haze. Every breath tasted of grit, and the wind, when it bothered to move, carried only more dust and the sour tang of sweat. Samuel Hart had no plans to linger in town that day. He had ridden in for two simple things: a coil of rope and a bag of coffee beans. But as he stepped out of the general store, the sharp, fevered rise and fall of voices drew his attention. It wasn't the casual hum of conversation. It was the tense, hungry sound of a crowd watching something they should be ashamed to see. The noise led him to the old grain warehouse, long since emptied of oats and feed. Now its warped wooden walls sheltered something far more unsettling: a rusted iron cage. Inside sat a young Apache woman, 19, maybe 20, with wrists bound by worn leather straps. A bruise bloomed across her cheek, and a cut at her temple had dried into a thin crust of blood. Yet her back remained straight, her chin high. Her dark eyes did not plead or dart nervously. They burned with a pride that no chain could touch. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. "Caught her east of Dry Rock," someone muttered. Others nodded knowingly, as though that explained or excused her captivity. Samuel's jaw tightened. Without thinking, he let the rope and coffee drop into the dirt and shrugged out of his leather coat. Walking up to the cage, he draped it gently over the top bars, shading her from the punishing sun. She glanced at him briefly, just a flicker, before returning her gaze to the horizon. The auctioneer's voice cracked the moment. $4, do I hear $4.50? The bidding climbed, the air thick with ugly anticipation. Then, $5. Samuel reached into his pocket, pulling out every coin he had. 4 silver dollars. It wasn't enough. From the edge of the crowd, Sheriff Amos Whitfield stepped forward, pressing a final coin into Samuel's palm. Their eyes met, no words exchanged, only understanding. With the full amount, Samuel met the auctioneer's stare. "Sold!" the man barked. The deputy unlocked the cage. Samuel crouched beside the woman. "My name's Samuel," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't answer, but when he turned toward his horse, he heard the faint sound of her footsteps behind him. The bill of sale, her name misspelled, crumpled into his pocket, already feeling like a weight he would one day have to burn. The road out of Dust Hollow was little more than a ribbon of pale dirt, bordered by brittle grass and scattered mesquite. The air shimmered in the heat, and the sky above seemed too wide, too empty. Samuel rode ahead in silence, his chestnut mare carrying the weight of his rope and coffee once more, though both were dirt-stained from being dropped. Beside him, Ayana walked with measured steps. Her wrists were raw where the straps had bitten into her skin, and a streak of dried blood still marked her temple. She had not spoken a word, not when the cage opened, not when she stepped into the sunlight, and not in the long stretch of road they had covered since. When they reached a cluster of cottonwoods, Samuel slowed. A thin stream ran there, its water glinting silver beneath the dappled shade. He dismounted, tying the mare to a low branch, and knelt by the bank. "You're bleeding," he said, not as an accusation, but as a plain truth. He pulled a clean cloth from his saddlebag, dipped it in the cool water, and held it out. She didn't move. "I'll be careful," he promised. Still no reply, but when he reached for her wrist, she didn't pull away. Gently he cleaned the raw skin, his calloused fingers careful not to press too hard. He moved to the bruise on her shoulder, then the cut at her temple. "You can tell me to stop," he murmured. Her gaze flickered toward him, not soft, but watchful, measuring whether his touch was another form of harm or something else entirely. When they set out again, Samuel could hear the low growl of his own stomach and guessed she hadn't eaten in days. The smell of beans and pork fat drifting from a small diner in the next town was enough to make his mouth water. He tied off the mare and motioned toward the door. Inside, conversation stopped. The woman behind the counter looked at Ayana, then at Samuel. "She ain't eating here," she said flatly. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Without a word, he turned, led Ayana back into the street, and headed further down the road. They passed under the bell above the door of Merriweather's Bread and Brew, a warm, inviting bakery owned by Martha Lindell. The woman emerged from the back, her apron dusted with flour, eyes kind but sharp. One glance at Ayana, and she waved them to a table. "No one deserves to eat alone," Martha said simply. A bowl of steaming stew was placed before Ayana. She stared at it for a long moment, spoon resting in her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The first sip seemed to catch her by surprise. Not for its taste, but for the unfamiliarity of being fed without strings attached. Her shoulders eased, just a fraction. Samuel looked away, suddenly aware of how much it moved him to see her eat. In that quiet bakery, for the first time since the auction, the air between them held something other than dust and distrust. The dirt road out of Dust Hollow was quiet except for the creak of leather and the soft clop of Samuel Hart's mare. The sun hung low now, but the heat still pressed against their backs, and a fine layer of dust clung to their skin. Beside him, Ayana walked with the steady, measured steps of someone conserving strength. Her wrists were red and raw, the skin abraded by the straps that had bound her in the cage. A faint trail of dried blood curved down from her temple into the shadows of her cheek. When they reached a bend in the road, the sound of water threaded through the heavy air. A narrow stream wound between cottonwoods, their branches casting dappled shade over the bank. Samuel slowed, then dismounted, looping the reins over a low limb. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. It wasn't a question, and his voice carried no judgment, just fact. He pulled a clean cloth from his saddlebag, dipped it into the cool water, and held it out to her. She hesitated, eyes fixed on him, as if weighing his intent. "I'll be careful," he promised. When he reached for her wrist, she didn't pull away. Samuel cleaned the raw skin with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his weathered hands. He moved on to the dark bruise shadowing her shoulder, then finally the cut at her temple. "You can tell me to stop," he murmured. Her gaze flickered toward him, measured, wary, but she stayed still. They resumed their journey in silence until the smell of food drifted down the street of a nearby settlement. The rich scent of beans and pork fat clung to the air outside a small diner. Samuel tied the mare, nodded for Ayana to follow, and stepped inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the hum of conversation faltered. The woman behind the counter looked from Samuel to Ayana, her face hardening. "She ain't eating here," she said flatly. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind them with a final, cold rattle. A few doors down, they stepped under the modest sign of Merriweather's Bread and Brew. A warm light spilled from its windows, and the smell of fresh bread and honey filled the air. From the back came Martha Lindell, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She took one look at Ayana, and her stern expression softened into something warmer. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a table near the window. "No one deserves to eat alone." Moments later, a steaming bowl of stew was placed before Ayana. She stared at it, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the spoon. The first sip was slow, deliberate, less a taste than a test. For a heartbeat, her eyes closed, and her shoulders eased as though some invisible weight had shifted. Samuel looked away, hiding the unexpected tug in his chest. For the first time since Dust Hollow, the air between them carried not suspicion, but the fragile beginnings of trust. By sunrise the next day, the whispers had already spread like prairie fire through Dust Hollow. What had happened at the grain warehouse was no longer a simple act of purchase and release. It had become a story, reshaped by every tongue that told it. To some, Samuel Hart was a fool. To others, he was a dangerous man who had bought himself a savage and meant to keep her as his wife. No one had asked him. No one had spoken to Ayana. But the truth didn't matter. Not when gossip could gallop faster than any horse in the territory. When Samuel stepped into the general store to buy flour and salt, the air inside felt colder than the shade outside. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper's wife kept her eyes fixed on the goods she was sorting, but when she finally looked up, her gaze went straight to Ayanna. "She's not welcome in here," the woman said, her tone clipped and final. Samuel didn't argue. He took the bag of supplies, paid with exact change, and turned without a word. Back on the street, the day's heat had begun to gather. Ayanna walked beside him, her steps quiet but steady. As they passed the blacksmith's shop, a tall man in a soot-stained apron leaned against the doorway. His eyes followed them, cold and narrow. Then he spat, the dark stain landing in the dust inches from Ayanna's bare feet. She stopped, her hands curling slightly. Not in fear, but in a readiness Samuel recognized. He placed a hand gently on her elbow. "Keep walking," he said softly, the weight in his voice leaving no room for argument. They moved on, leaving the stairs and mutters behind until the street thinned into open land. The sound of the town faded, replaced by the whisper of wind in the leaves. Beneath a tall cottonwood, its broad canopy casting a patch of welcome shade, Samuel stopped. For a moment, he stood with his back to her, reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. When he turned, his hand was cupped around a small, crinkled piece of waxed paper. He held it out. "It's a caramel," he said, almost awkwardly. "My mother used to give me one when I scraped my knee, or had a rough day. She said it wouldn't fix anything, but it might help me wait until it did." Nuck. Ayanna looked at the candy, then at him, her brow faintly furrowed. Slowly she took it. Her fingers were careful as she unwrapped the paper, as though it might crumble from age. She placed it in her mouth, chewing mechanically at first, her face unreadable. Then almost imperceptibly, her shoulders loosened, her jaw eased. And just for a heartbeat, the faintest curve touched her lips. Not gratitude, not yet trust, but the smallest flicker of something softer. Samuel didn't smile. He only turned his gaze toward the horizon, letting the quiet settle between them, like the shade of the cottonwood. Thin, but enough for now. Night had settled deep over the prairie, the moon a pale coin slipping between clouds. Samuel Hart was checking the latch on the barn door when hurried footsteps crunched over the hard-packed dirt. Martha Lindell emerged from the darkness, her bonnet askew, apron strings flapping in the wind. "They're coming," she said, breathless. "Silas Crowley, his boy, and a few others. They've been drinking, but not enough to slow them. They mean to take her back and make an example of you." Samuel didn't waste time asking how she knew. "Is your old mule still in the orchard?" She nodded. "Half blind, mean as sin, but she'll pull a cart west. Stay low. Don't stop." Within minutes, Samuel and Ayanna were on the rattling cart, the mule's ears flicking with irritation at every snap of the reins. The night air was sharp and carried the scent of sage. Behind them, the lights of Dust Hollow faded into the dark. They crossed dry creek beds and wound through stands of mesquite, wheels jostling over stones. The rhythm of the cart was almost lulling until the canyon closed in around them. Tall stone walls rose on either side, narrowing the trail to a choke point. The first rifle shot cracked the silence. The mule screamed, rearing, as the cart jolted violently. Samuel hauled on the reins, steadying the animal, but the damage was done. One wheel struck a rut, snapping a spoke. The cart leaned hard to one side, groaning under its own weight. "Off the trail," Samuel ordered, voice low but urgent. Ayanna jumped down, boots hitting the gravel. Another shot rang out, closer this time, the bullet sparking off rock. They scrambled up the canyon wall, hands clawing at stone and brush. The slope was steep and crumbling, every step threatening to send them sliding back. Samuel crouched, bracing himself. "Step on my back," he told her. Ayanna hesitated only for a second before planting her boot on his shoulder and pulling herself higher. He felt the strain in his knees, the grit grinding into his palms, but he didn't falter. She reached the top, then turned, hand outstretched. He took it, letting her haul him up the last stretch. At the summit, they dropped into the dust, chests heaving. The shouts of their pursuers echoed below, but the men hadn't started climbing. Yet, Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out the folded yellowed paper. By moonlight, the ink was just visible. Her name misspelled, a price of $5. He stared at it for a moment, then tore it once, twice, 3 times. The fragments fluttered from his fingers, caught by the wind and scattered down into the shadows. "You're free," he said, his voice calm as stone. Ayana's eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something older, heavier. She didn't speak, but she placed her dirt-streaked hand over his, her touch steady. Below them, the canyon still whispered with the sound of approaching boots. The night was far from over. By morning, the air in the canyon was sharp with cold, the kind that seeped into bone and made breath visible in pale streams. Samuel and Ayana had spent the night crouched between 2 slabs of rock, watching the shadows shift as the moon fell, and the first gray light touched the stone walls. They both knew the quiet would not last. The crunch of gravel under boots broke it first, then voices, low and confident, coming from both ends of the gulch. Samuel glanced at Ayana. Her knife was already in hand, blade angled down, her face set in a mask of calm readiness. From the east end, Ethan Crowley's voice rose, echoing off the canyon walls. "Hart, you've got no way out. Hand over the girl, and you can walk away." Samuel didn't move. The words carried easily in the still morning air when he finally answered. "She made me want to stand up and be heard. That's why." A pause, then harsh laughter from the west side, where Luke Mercer's men were closing in. "Romantic talk won't save you," someone jeered. "You can't fight all of us." Samuel crouched lower behind the rock ledge, checking his rifle and placing extra cartridges within reach. "Maybe not," he said under his breath, "but you'll pay for every step." Ayana shifted to cover the opposite side, her body angled to use the stone as a shield. The echoes of their pursuers' movements bounced around the gulch, making it hard to tell how close they were. Then came the metallic snick of a rifle bolt sliding into place. Ayana's grip tightened on her knife. The air thickened with the expectation of gunfire. Before the first shot could ring out, another voice cut through the tension. Steady, authoritative. "Drop your weapons!" Heads turned toward the narrow trail above. Amos Whitfield stood there, flanked by 2 strangers in dark coats and wide-brimmed hats. They weren't carrying rifles, only leather-bound satchels and badges glinting in the early light. "These men," Amos said, gesturing to his companions, "are officers of the Civil Rights Court of El Paso. Under Federal Statute 241, any attempt to seize this woman is conspiracy to deny liberty to a free citizen." Ethan's face blanched. "That law ain't even passed in this county," Luke Mercer growled. "It has," Amos replied evenly, "and I've got the ink to prove it." The men shifted uneasily. One of the officers stepped forward, pulling a pair of iron cuffs from his bag. "You can come quietly, or we can make you." Luke spat in the dirt and bolted toward the ridge. No one chased him. Ethan, pale and stiff, let the cuffs close around his wrists. The rest melted away into the canyon's shadows. Samuel lowered his rifle, the tension finally leaking from his shoulders. Ayana met his eyes, no words passing between them, only the quiet recognition that, for the first time in days, the danger had passed. For now. 6 months had passed since the standoff in the gulch, and the ranch no longer felt like the quiet, hollow place Samuel Hart had once inhabited alone. Where the front yard had been bare dirt, rows of bright yellow sunflowers now swayed in the breeze. Ayana's doing. Chickens clucked in a sturdy coop by the barn, and a vegetable garden stretched in neat green rows behind the house, beets and corn pushing up through rich, dark soil. Ayana's presence was everywhere, not just in the land but in the life that filled it. Twice a week, Apache children from the settlement near Bear Ridge rode or walked to the ranch. Samuel would watch from the porch as they gathered under the shade of the old cottonwood, Ayana kneeling beside them, chalk in hand, teaching letters in both English and Apache. Laughter and the sound of little voices filled the air, sounds this place had never known. The town, too, had begun to change. The same people who once looked away now nodded in greeting when she passed. Mrs. Porter from the bakery left a jar of jam on their gate one morning. Even Mr. Duran, who had once stared hard at her every time they crossed paths, now tipped his hat. One crisp morning, as sunlight spilled gold over the porch, Samuel called her name. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, hair braided neatly down her back. On the table between them lay a folded parchment, its ink fresh, a small tin box beside it, holding a stamp and red ribbon. "What's this?" she asked, brows knitting. "It's the deed," Samuel said. "To what?" "To all of it," he replied. "The ranch, the livestock, the water rights, the name carved into the barn. This place is alive because of you. I was just waiting to die before you came along. You've built a home out of wreckage, and no one should hold a thing they didn't earn. You've earned it 10 times over." Her hand hovered above the parchment before closing gently around it. Samuel's voice softened. "I didn't save you, Ayanna. You saved yourself. And me too." For a moment she couldn't speak. The wind lifted the edge of the paper, and in her eyes shone the weight of everything those words meant. The evening was still, the horizon painted in strokes of rose and gold as the sun sank behind the hills. Samuel Hart stood in the small field behind the house, a quiet fire crackling at his feet. In his hand was the last remnant of a day he wished had never happened, the crumpled bill of sale from Dust Hollow. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged, her name misspelled beside the price. $5. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Then, without ceremony, he held it to the flame. The edges curled black, the paper resisting at first before it caught, flaring bright and sudden. Ash rose into the cooling air, carried westward until it disappeared into the darkening sky. Spring came with wildflowers and the soft hum of bees in the garden Ayanna had coaxed into life. One morning, under the arching blooms of sunflowers and wild roses, they were married. No preacher, no crowded church, just the earth beneath their feet, the open sky above, and a handful of neighbors and children from Ayanna's classes standing among the rows of green. Samuel had built a wooden arbor for the occasion, its beams carved with small, careful patterns. Ayanna wore a simple dress of deep green cotton, her hair braided and threaded with tiny white blossoms. When he took her hands in his, they did not speak long vows. They didn't need to. Their choice was clear to everyone who stood witness. They had not come together out of debt or pity, nor out of any notion of rescue. They had chosen each other freely, out of respect, out of shared ground forged in hardship and trust. As the afternoon light softened and the garden filled with gentle laughter, Samuel and Ayanna stood side by side, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. There were no more chains, no more papers, only the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. And so Samuel and Ayanna's story reminds us that the truest bonds are not forged by rescue or obligation, but by respect, trust, and the courage to stand side by side. In the America of today, those lessons still matter. We may no longer see dusty main streets or hear the echo of spurs on wooden boardwalks, but we do face moments when we must choose. Do we stand silent or do we speak for what's right? This tale asks us to consider, how often do we judge before we understand? How quick are we to listen to gossip rather than seek the truth ourselves? Samuel looked past the prejudice of his time and saw a person, not a rumor. That choice in 1867 or in 2025 takes courage. Maybe that's the question we leave you with. In your own life, who would you stand up for when it's easier to walk away? And if someone stood up for you, would you accept their hand, or would you still doubt it? Some might see this ending as complete, 2 lives rebuilt, a home created from nothing. Others might wonder, what trials still waited for them beyond the last page? Could the town's acceptance truly hold, or would another test of loyalty rise? We'll leave that to your imagination and to the conversations in the comments. Thank you for riding with us through this story on the West that never left. If it stirred a memory, a lesson, or even a question in your heart, share it below. We'd love to read your thoughts. And if you believe more people should hear stories of dignity, resilience, and love on the frontier, please like this video, subscribe, and ring that bell. Because here in the West that never left, some trails are worth walking together, no matter the century.